Good afternoon, folks. Welcome back to the Philosophy for Philistines channel with your host, this guy, Bill Reimer. Today I'd like to discuss the narcissism of men and women who have too much unfounded conviction. Narcissism results in the inability to change one's position. Nothing you can say to a narcissist can change their mind or make them admit they were wrong. This condition exists independently of the narcissist's beliefs, whether they be religious, political, or philosophical. Moreover, this tendency only becomes amplified where groups of like-minded ideologues have become heavily invested in their ideology of choice. The nature of their ideological possession in and of itself is immaterial. I am referring to the inability of the narcissist to consider any information or ideas which might challenge his or her ideological convictions. The reason I often insist that there are no simple solutions to the multivariate issues we face as a society is due to the complexity of human nature. Like-minded individuals will invariably seek to assuage the discomfort when confronted with information that contradicts the validity of their belief system. Presently, we are witnessing people becoming ever more entrenched in their ideological positions who are completely convinced that they are right and that their opponents are wrong, without ever considering any valid criticism presented to them which counters their position. These alternative opinions create psychological tension and inner conflict in the ideologue. Therefore, the ideologically possessed will react with hostility when presented with information that challenges or disproves their beliefs. This reaction is known as cognitive dissonance, which is the psychological theory that explains their discomfort. It was first identified by renowned American psychologist, researcher, and author Leon Festinger, who is responsible for developing cognitive dissonance theory as well as social comparison theory. Challenging the dominance of behaviorism, Festinger spearheaded methods of scientific experimentation used to study social psychology. So how does cognitive dissonance manifest itself? Here are a few quotes from Dr. Festinger himself to provide some perspective. A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point. We have all experienced the futility of trying to change a strong conviction, especially if the convinced person has some investment in his belief. We are familiar with a variety of ingenious defenses with which people protect their convictions, managing to keep them unscathed through the most devastating attacks. But man's resourcefulness goes beyond simply protecting a belief. Suppose an individual believes something with his whole heart. Suppose further that he has a commitment to this belief and that he has taken irrevocable actions because of it. Suppose that he is presented with evidence, unequivocal and undeniable evidence, that his belief is wrong. What will happen? The individual will frequently emerge not only unshaken, but even more convinced of the truth of his beliefs than ever before. Indeed, he even may show a new fervor about convincing and converting other people to his point of view. That, again, by Dr. Leon Festinger, out of his book, When Prophecy Fails, a social and psychological study of a modern group that predicted the destruction of the world. Another quote from Dr. Festinger: when people are committed to a belief and a course of action, clear disconfirming evidence may simply result in deepen conviction, and increase proselytizing. But there does seem to be a point at which the disconfirming evidence has mounted sufficiently to cause the belief to be rejected. Dr. Leon Festinger, When Prophecy Fails, again from the book A Social and Psychological Study of a Modern Group That Predicted the Destruction of the World. If more and more people can be persuaded that the system of belief is correct, then clearly it must after all be correct. Again, by Dr. Leon Festinger, When Prophecy Fails, again the same book. The existence of dissonance, being psychologically uncomfortable, will motivate the person to try to reduce the dissonance and achieve consonance. When dissonance is present, in addition to trying to reduce it, the person will actively avoid situations and information which would likely increase the dissonance. That's by Dr. Leon Festinger, from A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance. At the end of his quotes, and me beginning again with my thoughts, we are witnessing ideological convictions deepen and divide us under the influence of a social struggle altogether too reminiscent of the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels. Be aware that the governing and globalist elite understand this phenomenon and have weaponized it to divide and conquer us. If we cannot create a space where open discourse and inquiry prevail against them, then civil society will fail. Moreover, if we are unable to develop the humility to admit that our knowledge is limited, and that it will take all of us united in voluntary cooperation to learn from one another, then we will have truly screwed the proverbial pooch. There will be no turning back. Western liberal democracy is utterly dependent upon open, reasoned discourse and compromise. Our ancestors were smart enough to know that they did not know it all, which is why they drafted constitutions and created laws to limit the arbitrary power of the state. If we proceed on our current path, the governing elite will manage to have created a ruling class little different from the age of absolute monarchy. You will often hear and read me criticize the inherent imperfections and shortcomings of our most cherished institutions and beliefs, the very ones I also cherish. When I was first introduced to Christ at the age of 15, the man who led me in prayer drove me home after that meeting and told me to read the Bible from cover to cover. It was good advice, but a daunting task, especially given the depth of the metaphorical meaning of the scriptures, not to mention the need for revelation to begin to come to terms with what those stories actually mean. It was then I found that those who claimed to follow the full gospel were not, and undoubtedly, nor does any man. Rather, they had fallen prey to the sin of pride. Narcissism, after all, is merely another way of describing pride. I do not have God in a box, and neither did the man who led me to Christ. Over the years, I have heard the most ridiculous and unscriptural things stated as gospel truth. I have seen the worst excesses of greed and money changers in the temple. There is no humility in that kind of religion. I believe there's an old Methodist saying which goes something like, the more religion you see in a shopkeeper's window, the less you know is inside the shopkeeper. I ran into a pastor last year while out walking my wee chihuahua in the dog park. We became involved in a discussion which is desperately needed to be heard in the churches today. One on the nature of postmodernism, critical theory, cancel culture, woke, and diversity, inclusiveness, and equity, which Dr. Gad Saad calls the die religion. Specifically, how these toxic ideologies are in fact mental pathogens which afford those who hold on to them a way of virtue signaling without ever having developed moral character. I offered the pastor my assistance and suggested that my vodcast and blog might be useful to assist him in developing a speaking series which would engage Christians encountering the prevalent social pathologies of today in a Christian setting. Rather than accepting my help, he turned down my offer by stating that he was too busy drafting sermons. Yes, yet more pablum instead of feeding them mature meat so they might assume their responsibility as ambassadors of Christ. Indeed, he was too busy to warn the believers of the present danger to society and indeed to the church. If we cannot criticize and counter those things which society deemed to be sacred cows, we will find ourselves left worshipping those very sacred cows. I want to know when I'm wrong, as I am confronted by a world of infinite complexity. I am also aware that I must be wrong in many ways I have yet to discover. The only solution to that is to ask for divine wisdom, as well as to cultivate the humility to know that finite creatures such as we cannot apprehend much. Certainly, we do not have God, the very Lord of the infinite, wrapped up neatly in our doctrinal box. Pride resides at the apex of the 7 deadly sins. Pride is manifested by narcissistic projection, a condition where we own nothing while projecting our inadequacies onto others. Narcissistic projection always tells you far more about the narcissist than it does about the one whom the narcissist is attacking. And face it, the very conditional premise of being a Christian is based upon the realization that we are all sinners who fall far short of the glory of God. When I encounter Christians who are utterly unwilling to examine the failure of the church to be the salt of the earth, even as we are admonished to do, I am seeing the self-same species of psychological projection that the woke use when confronted with facts that they cannot handle. Cognitive dissonance belongs to anyone arrogant enough to believe that their dogma is absolute without ever considering evidence to the contrary. And from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. God you bless you all, folks, leading up to the first Advent Sunday. Hope you have a wonderful one, and I wish all my American cousins a very wonderful Thanksgiving. Have a great afternoon.